The Louisiana Chronicles. A Legacy of Accountability. Chapter 1. The Weight of the Hallowed Halls. The atmospheric density within the historic House Ethics Committee chamber was so profoundly oppressive that it felt as though it might stifle the very spirits of the past. It was not merely the physical heat generated by 400 individuals compressed into a space meticulously designed for 300. Rather, it was the palpable tension, a vibrating, physical gravity that seemed to resonate through the ancient floorboards of the Rayburn Building. Outside, the Potomac River stretched out like a cold slab of gray slate beneath a Washington sky bruised with charcoal clouds. Yet inside these walls, the entire world had narrowed its focus to a single, polished, mahogany table. Every high-definition lens in the nation's capital was calibrated toward that singular piece of furniture, their dark apertures resembling the silent muzzles of a firing squad's rifles. At the epicenter of this storm sat Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. A study in carefully curated poise, her hijab secured with surgical precision, and her countenance reflecting a stoic mask that signaled a long history of enduring adversity. Positioned directly across from her was Senator John Kennedy, an individual who, despite not holding a seat on this specific committee, had been invited as a guardian of constitutional jurisprudence, a strategic appointment that sent a ripple of apprehension through the opposing ranks. Kennedy did not carry the demeanor of an official preparing for a political execution. Instead, he possessed the relaxed air of a storyteller, ready to share a cautionary tale on a shaded porch in Baton Rouge. He adjusted his spectacles with the slow, rhythmic deliberation of a man who understood that he possessed the luxury of time, while his adversary was rapidly running out of it. "Congresswoman Omar," Kennedy began, his voice a thick, slow-moving syrup of a Louisiana drawl that stretched every vowel with the elasticity of pulled taffy. "I am merely a plain-spoken country attorney from the bayous, and I am the first to confess that I lack the sophisticated intellect of the elite who navigate this city. However, I find myself plagued by certain inquiries that disturb my rest, and I suspect these same questions are haunting the sleep of many decent citizens across this land." He leaned forward, his elbows making contact with the table with a dull thud that carried the symbolic weight of a judge's gavel. "I would urge you to contemplate your responses with the utmost gravity," Kennedy remarked, his gaze narrowing into sharp points of focus, "because approximately 10 million Americans are observing this proceeding in real time, and those individuals are possessed of exceptionally long memories." The ensuing silence was total, broken only by the mechanical hum of the ventilation and the frantic, rhythmic scratching of journalists' pens against paper. Kennedy opened a blue folder with surgical precision. The opening movement of the reckoning had commenced. Chapter 2. The Widow's Mite and the German Sedan. "Let us initiate our inquiry with the matter of finances," Kennedy remarked, his fingers tapping the surface of the folder 3 times in a rhythmic cadence. "In the culture where I was raised, one can discern the true measure of a person's character by examining the origins of their wealth and the manner in which they distribute it." He extracted a solitary, weathered sheet of paper that appeared as though it had been creased and smoothed 1,000 times over. "Congresswoman, this document pertains to a citizen named Betty Henderson, a 68-year-old retired nurse residing in Duluth, Minnesota. Betty dedicated 4 decades of her life to the noble labor of tending to the sick, dressing wounds, and offering solace to those entering their final moments. She is a virtuous woman of profound faith." Kennedy elevated the paper so the cameras could capture its worn edges. "Betty subsists on Social Security, a mere $1,500 a month. In the harsh winters of Minnesota, that sum barely covers the basic necessities of warmth and sustenance. Yet, she was moved by your rhetoric. She heard your proclamations about championing the cause of the marginalized. Consequently, she contributed $50 funds she likely required for her own medication and sent it to your cause with a simple plea. Please utilize this to advocate for us. Kennedy's voice descended into a soft whisper that nonetheless resonated to the furthest corners of the room. Are you aware of the final destination of those $50, madam? Omar exhaled a sharp, defensive breath. Senator, every campaign expenditure is documented and disclosed in accordance with federal guidelines. If you are implying, I am not merely implying, I am declaring a fact, Kennedy interrupted, his tone hardening like molten iron meeting cold water. That contribution did not serve Betty's interests. It was funneled into a consulting firm owned by your spouse, ultimately facilitating the lease of a silver BMW. While Betty was forced to consume canned soup to preserve her meager savings, your campaign was directing $250,000 into your own household under the guise of strategic advisory services. Now, I may only be a country lawyer, but to the average citizen, that bears a striking resemblance to a legal method of plundering a widow's resources. He gestured toward the third row of the gallery. Betty has joined us today, Congresswoman. She traveled by bus from Duluth to be here. Betty, would you please stand for a moment? A diminutive, fragile woman with silver hair rose slowly, her hands trembling as she held onto the seat for support. Look into her eyes, Kennedy commanded, with sudden steel. Look at Betty and explain to her why her $50 were better utilized for your family's luxury vehicle payments than for the equity you so frequently champion in your oratory. Omar remained motionless, her eyes fixed on her notes, her jaw clenched with such intensity that the tendons in her neck were visibly strained. The chamber had been transformed. It was no longer a legislative room, but a sanctuary of confession. Chapter 3. The Long Silence of Mohammed Hassan. Kennedy allowed no opportunity for recovery before continuing his pursuit. He transitioned to a second dossier, this one overflowing with immigration documentation and official seals from the Somali government. Let us discuss the infrastructure you frequently characterize as broken, Kennedy stated, his tone shifting toward a clinical analysis. You argue that our national borders are too restrictive and that our policies lack basic human compassion. I would like to introduce you to a man named Mohammed Hassan. A gentleman in his 50s stood up in the 8th row, wearing a suit that was slightly too large for his frame, a garment clearly purchased specifically for the dignity of this occasion. His face was a complex topography of exhaustion and unyielding integrity. Mohammed arrived in the United States from Somalia as a documented refugee, Kennedy elucidated. He adhered to every regulation, completed every form, and paid every requisite fee. He waited with a patience that borders on the saintly. Mohammed, could you share with us how long it took to bring your daughter to these shores? 12 years, Mohammed replied, his voice carrying the weight of his heritage but remaining remarkably clear. I was absent for her 8th birthday, her 10th, and her 15th. I missed the entirety of her childhood because I chose to honor the statutes of my adopted home. Kennedy stepped toward the witness table. 12 years of separation. Mohammed followed the established path without seeking shortcuts or creative interpretations of the law. Yet, you, Congresswoman, your trajectory appears to have been significantly more expedited. There are persistent questions regarding your matrimonial history and timelines that defy conventional logic questions about utilizing the system to bypass individuals who, like Mohammed, waited their turn. That is nothing more than a baseless fabrication, Omar retorted, her voice escalating in volume for the first time. It is a matter of public record, Kennedy drawled. Mohammed's daughter is now 20 years old. She sits beside him today. She addresses him as Mohammed rather than father, because he was effectively a stranger to her for over a decade. While you were navigating the system to consolidate your own influence, men of integrity were suffering. You do not seek to mend the system, Congresswoman. You seek to ensure the rules only apply to those outside your inner circle. Beside her father, Amina began to weep softly, a sound that, in the stillness of the room, carried the emotional impact of a structural collapse. Kennedy allowed the gravity of that sound to fill the chamber for a long, poignant minute. Chapter 4. The Mark of Exclusion. Now, let us contemplate the profound weight of our public discourse, Kennedy remarked, his voice transitioning into an icy, crystalline tone. He produced a photograph of a high school classroom door, defaced with a spray-painted symbol of hatred. This image was captured at Roosevelt High School in Minneapolis, Kennedy said. And this is the classroom of Sarah Goldstein. Sarah, would you be so kind as to stand? A woman in her 30s rose to her feet. Though her expression betrayed a deep-seated fear, she stood with remarkable posture. Sarah is an educator of history, a vocation she has pursued for 8 years. She is a woman of Jewish heritage who maintains an unwavering belief in the American promise. However, after you disseminated messages suggesting that support for our allies was motivated solely by financial interests, invoking harmful tropes about the Benjamins, Sarah's reality was irrevocably altered. Sarah took the microphone, her hands shaking. I arrived at work that Monday to find my door desecrated. Beneath the symbol, someone had inscribed, "Omar revealed the truth about you. My students, children I have nurtured, began to question my loyalty to this country. I was forced to take medical leave. I lived in fear of simply walking to my vehicle. I removed my grandmother's Star of David, the one she carried through the horrors of the Holocaust, because I no longer felt secure in my own community." Kennedy placed the photograph firmly on Omar's desk, a symbol of faith hidden in America because of the climate your words helped create. You did not merely critique a foreign policy. You signaled to every dormant bigot in this nation. You suggested that a specific group of citizens lacked loyalty, and Sarah Goldstein paid the price in threats and psychological trauma. I cannot be held accountable for the independent actions of extremists, Omar stated with a cold detachment. When you hold a commission in the United States Congress, you are indeed responsible for the fires you ignite, Kennedy countered. You provided the spark, and Sarah felt the flames. Furthermore, you have failed to offer a sincere apology, choosing instead those hollow, "I'm sorry if you were offended" statements that possess no moral value. Sarah sat down, her hand instinctively going to the necklace she now wore with renewed defiance. Omar was visibly vibrating not with sorrow, but with a simmering, resonant fury that was being broadcast in high definition to the entire world. Chapter 5. The Granite Pillar of Remembrance. The silence that followed Sarah's testimony was of a different quality, heavy and somber, reminiscent of the air in a cathedral following a funeral liturgy. Kennedy allowed the moment to breathe, ensuring the image of that hidden necklace remained at the forefront of the public consciousness. Then he shifted his demeanor, replacing his previous tone with a cold, impenetrable solemnity. "We must address the sanctity of memory, Congresswoman," Kennedy said, his voice dropping into a lower register. "We must speak of the day the foundation of our world was shaken. We must speak of September the 11th. He did not reach for a dossier this time. He simply rested his palms on the table and directed his gaze toward a man in the final row. Captain Thomas Brady, FDNY, retired. Please rise, sir. A man in his late 50s stood, his dress blue, uniform impeccable, the brass ornaments reflecting the studio lights. His face appeared as though it had been carved from weathered granite, unyielding and timeless. He stood at an effortless military attention, a posture his body remembered through decades of service. Captain Brady was stationed with Ladder Company, 15 inches lower Manhattan, on that fateful Tuesday, Kennedy said quietly. He was among the first to enter the South Tower. He spent 3 harrowing weeks at Ground Zero, inhaling the very dust that this government is still debating how to compensate for. Kennedy paused to let the weight of that sacrifice settle. Captain Brady lost 16 members of his firehouse that day, 16 brothers in spirit. And he lost his biological brother, Deputy Chief Daniel Brady, who was last observed ascending the stairs of the North Tower to save others while the world was collapsing. And yet, at a fundraiser for a private interest group, you described that day, the day Captain Brady's brother was lost, the day 3,000 innocent lives were extinguished as some people did something. A low, visceral murmur swept through the gallery, a sound of genuine horror. Kennedy walked away from his seat to stand beside the retired firefighter. "Captain," Kennedy said, "would you care to describe to the Congresswoman what some people doing something feels like to a family that was shattered?" Brady did not look at the senator. His eyes were fixed on a point in the distance. When he spoke, his voice sounded like crushed stone, rough and deep. "My brother Danny left behind 3 children. The youngest was an infant. We found his helmet blocks away. We never found Danny. We didn't find something in those ruins, Congresswoman. We found remnants of our friends. We found wedding bands still on fingers. It wasn't some people. It was an army of terrorists. It wasn't something. It was a declaration of war against our families." He finally turned his gaze toward Omar, eyes that were dry, but burned with an intensity that caused her to visibly recoil. "You hold office in the capital of this republic. You swore an oath to defend it. And yet you minimized the greatest tragedy of our era to a clever line for a banquet speech. You desecrated my brother's memory for a political soundbite." Kennedy placed a steadying hand on Brady's shoulder. "Do you have a response for the captain? Any context you wish to provide?" Omar's lips parted, then closed. She looked around the room as if searching for an exit that did not exist. For the first time, the defiance was gone. She appeared utterly diminished. Brady shook his head slowly. "Do not bother, Senator. She lacks the vocabulary. People of her ilk never have the words when they are forced to confront the debris they leave in their wake." Chapter 6. The Key to a Lost Legacy. Kennedy returned to his seat, his gait appearing more labored as the emotional gravity of the proceedings took its toll. However, he was not yet finished. There remained one final piece of the mosaic. "We have examined the past," Kennedy said, organizing his documents. "Now, let us address the present reality. Let us discuss the economic future you claim to be building." He signaled to the gallery. "James Morrison, please come forward." A man in his late 40s walked down the aisle, his posture reflecting a profound sense of defeat. His jacket was worn, and his eyes held the hollow expression of someone who had long since forgotten the comfort of sleep. Kennedy guided him to a seat directly in Omar's line of vision. "James was the proprietor of a hardware store in Minneapolis," Kennedy explained. "Morrison's Hardware on Lake Street. James, tell us of the history of that establishment." James cleared his throat, his voice trembling. "My grandfather founded it in 1958. My father managed it for 30 years. I took the reins in 2010. We survived every economic downturn and every corporate competitor. We were the heart of that neighborhood." "And what occurred during that summer, James?" "Protests escalated into chaos. The Congresswoman, she delivered speeches characterized businesses as exploiters and suggested that destruction was a necessary part of a revolution. They arrived on a Thursday. They shattered the windows and systematically destroyed everything: the inventory, the records, the history. They ignited a fire that consumed 60 years of my family's labor in 2 hours. Kennedy leaned in. Was there no insurance? The policy had an exclusion for civil unrest that we couldn't overcome. And the city. The authorities stood by and watched it burn, seemingly hesitant to intervene against the movement you were encouraging. James looked at Omar, tears of frustration forming. I provided jobs for 12 local residents. They lost their livelihoods. I lost my life savings and my children's future. Kennedy reached into his pocket and produced a tarnished brass key, placing it on the table. What is this, James? James stared at the object, a single tear tracing a path through his stubble. That is the key to the front door. It is all that remains. The bank has taken the land. It is nothing but a vacant lot of dirt now. Kennedy held the key up for the room to see. This is your revolution, Congresswoman, he said, his voice laced with a quiet, devastating venom. It is not a poetic endeavor. It is a broken man, clinging to a key to a door that no longer exists. You fueled the flames of resentment while remaining secure in your D.C. residence, leaving James to watch his legacy turn to ash on the news. He dropped the key onto the table in front of her. The sharp metallic clink resonated like the closing of a cell door. Keep that, Kennedy said. Place it next to your accolades. Let it serve as a permanent reminder of the human cost of your rhetoric. Omar stared at the key, her hands trembling uncontrollably. The facade had disintegrated, leaving only the wreckage of the confrontation. Chapter 7. The Receding Tide. As Kennedy leaned back, the air in the chamber seemed to shift. He looked at the 5 individuals he had brought forward: Betty, Mohammed, Sarah, Captain Brady, and James, a representative cross-section of American life, each bearing scars from the same source. I have concluded my inquiry, Kennedy stated softly. The room did not merely erupt in applause. It experienced a catharsis. A standing ovation began in the furthest rows and surged forward like a tidal wave, enveloping the room in a wall of sound that served as a collective rejection of the status quo. Omar sat in the center of the noise, isolated and defeated. Her staff had already begun their silent exit. Their focus already shifted to damage control and exit strategies. Kennedy rose, fastened his jacket, and departed without a second glance. He did not need to witness the conclusion. He understood the physics of an avalanche. Within moments, the footage was circulating globally, not as edited snippets, but as raw, unvarnished depictions of human truth. The images of Betty's trembling hand, Mohammed's silent dignity, and the sound of James's key hitting the mahogany went viral, transcending political boundaries. By the evening, the exodus of support had begun. Corporate donors issued cold statements of suspension. By nightfall, key staff members had resigned, citing irreconcilable differences. But the most significant development was the silence from her usual allies. The firebrands, who usually dominated social media, were nowhere to be found. They recognized the reality. Defending the indefensible in the face of such human testimony was a political impossibility. Ilhan Omar had become an island. Chapter 8. The Landscape of Change. In the following weeks, the political geography of Minneapolis underwent a seismic shift. The district that was once considered a stronghold of radicalism was now a place of quiet reflection and reconsidered loyalties. Omar did not resign, choosing instead to lean into her brand of defiance. But she became a spectral figure in the capital. Colleagues avoided eye contact, and in her home district, the cheering crowds were replaced by somber citizens holding signs asking about Betty's $50. Her primary opponent, a pragmatic leader with deep local ties, needed only to speak of restoration and accountability. He did not need to attack her. The demolition had already been completed by a country lawyer with a blue folder. The polling data was a relentless decline. from a slight lead to a double-digit deficit within days. When the final tallies arrived on election night, the result was not just a loss. It was a total repudiation of her tenure. Her final speech was brief, lacking the old fire, and as she departed the stage, she left behind the small brass key James Morrison had given her, a heavy piece of metal that had signaled the end of an era. Chapter 9. The Architecture of Hope. While one career reached its twilight, a new chapter was being written for the victims. The grassroots support ignited by the hearing resulted in a massive influx of resources. Within months, James Morrison was not just rebuilding, he was expanding. The new Morrison Family Legacy Store became a symbol of resilience, with a line of customers that stretched for blocks on opening day. Senator Kennedy himself was present for the ribbon cutting, remarking that when a good man is knocked down, the community doesn't just help him up, they help him build something better. In Duluth, Betty Henderson used the support she received to establish a scholarship for aspiring nurses, ensuring her legacy of care would continue through others. Sarah Goldstein returned to her vocation with a new purpose, leading national initiatives on civic courage and ensuring that symbols of faith would never again have to be hidden in fear. Muhammad Hassan and Amina finally saw their lost years acknowledged through legislative reforms that prioritized those who followed the law, ensuring that no other family would be separated by a broken bureaucracy. On the day of his naturalization, Muhammad looked at the flag and knew that his integrity had finally been recognized. Chapter 10. The Echo of Simple Truths. The Louisiana lesson did not merely end a political career. It awakened a dormant national conscience. John Kennedy's approach, centered on simple, moral questions rather than partisan rhetoric, struck a chord with a public weary of complexity and corruption. 4 years later, that momentum carried him to the highest office in the land. His presidency was defined not by massive, unreadable bills, but by clear acts of transparency and accountability, named after the citizens he had defended. He replaced global summits with town halls, focusing on the people who had felt forgotten by the system. His legacy was built on the restoration of a fundamental American truth, that those in power are ultimately servants of the people, and they must be prepared to answer for their actions. Epilogue. The Eternal Sentinel. When John Kennedy passed away at the age of 88, his farewell was a historic gathering of the lives he had touched. The front rows were not filled with dignitaries, but with the families of those he had stood for: the Morrisons, the Hassans, and the Goldsteins. His resting place in Baton Rouge was marked by a simple stone, devoid of titles or honors, bearing only the words, "A simple country lawyer." He asked the questions. He delivered justice. He never forgot Betty. As the sun dipped below the horizon of the Mississippi, a young student of the law stood before the grave, holding a replica of a small brass key. He left it there as a promise. He knew that as long as the memory of that day in the Rayburn Building endured, there would always be someone willing to stand up, lean forward, and ask, "I don't mean any disrespect, but I have a simple question.